So in this particular section, what we're going to talk about is how we diagnose psychological disorders in a more global sort of way, and a little bit more about the general number of people who have psychological disorders in the United States. We're also going to talk just a little bit more about some cultural differences when it comes to how disorders are experienced, and also just differences in how people process stress. So the way that we diagnose disorders in the United States is through use of a manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is now in its 5th edition. So the DSM, as it's otherwise called, is basically a manual of psychological disorders and symptoms. This has a few different pieces to it, and let's go ahead and work our way through it. So first of all, it has developed a checklist approach to diagnose a particular psychological disorder. There are some folks who are critical of this particular approach, but most people who are diagnosing someone with a disorder will look at this checklist of symptoms and see how many symptoms people experience, how severe those symptoms are, and how long they've had them for, and someone must meet a certain number of those particular criteria in order to receive a formal diagnosis with a given disorder. So once again, the number of symptoms, how long they've had it for, and how severe those symptoms are. Another piece of information that the DSM provides is how common these disorders are, as well as who is more likely to have them. So how frequently do they occur in the population in terms of just general epidemiology, and are there specific groups that tend to experience certain disorders more than others? So for example, very briefly, before I get into the next piece of this, men are far more often than women to experience schizophrenia. However, schizophrenia is fairly rarely occurring in the population. So the DSM tracks the number of people diagnosed every year and does breakdowns by things like gender, age ranges, as well as racial and ethnic identity in order to explore those trends. One of the studies that I often have my upper division students read is a really famous study done by Rosenhan called the pseudopatient study, where what he did was he wanted to do an expose on how easy it was back in the 1960s for people to get diagnosed with psychological disorders. So what he did was he had a bunch of his friends go to different hospitals all over the country and claim that they heard a voice in their head that said hollow, empty, and thud. That was the only symptom that they displayed, and otherwise they expressed themselves in a normal way. All of his friends were immediately diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and were institutionalized, some for as little as 3 weeks, one for as long as 3 months before they were released by the hospital. While they were institutionalized, the people who were institutionalized who were otherwise, once again, psychologically healthy and didn't actually hear voices, they just pretended that they had, took notes about their experiences. This led to a sea change in the 1970s when it came to how we diagnose disorders, and led to a call for increased consistency in terms of how we diagnose someone. So you can no longer receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia if your only symptom is that you hear voices. Once again, this is the 5th edition. One of the things that means is that it's gone through several revisions. It's important for this particular manual to stay up to date in terms of how we currently consider disorders. And once again, there have been some edits over the years. So for example, in the 1970s, homosexuality was removed from the DSM as a psychological disorder. It was considered to be a behavior that was deviant, in that it was unusual or rare, but it was not necessarily something that was considered to be harmful to society or to the self. And the only source of distress was people's reactions to that particular individual's identity. So society could cause distress if society was not understanding, but that the homosexual individual in question, him or herself, was not disordered. Hoarding, for example, in the 5th edition of the DSM, has moved from a symptom of obsessive compulsive disorder to its own category in compulsive spectrum disorder sort of format. So we've shifted how we categorize hoarding as its own unique disorder and have expanded on that particular definition. So each edition changes how we perceive disorders based on our expanded understanding of what consists of disordered behavior, what we consider to be disordered, and also, once again, our expanded knowledge of a particular type of disorder like hoarding and how it's different than just a form of obsessive compulsive disorder. So just in terms of some general context, the DSM identifies about 250 different psychological disorders in the manual. In a given year, about a quarter of American adults suffer from mental disorder, and it's thought that during the course of one's lifetime, about 1 in 4 Americans will experience a psychological disorder episode of some kind. Some things are very common, like a depressive episode or an anxious episode, and those are far more likely to occur. Along those lines, about 5.8% of individuals suffer from a severe mental disorder, something like schizophrenia, for example, or dissociative identity disorder. So most people who have a mental disorder do not necessarily have something that would classify as extreme or severe. One of the challenges with psychological disorders is that it's actually fairly common to have more than one. Disorders tend to accumulate. If you have one, you're more likely to have two. If you have two, you're more likely to have three, and so on and so forth. So sometimes it can be challenging to sort through the sorts of challenges that people experience and to come up with the different disorders that they're going through. We call the presence of multiple disorders comorbidity. So when one disorder co-occurs with another, that would be comorbidity. It's also important to note that some patterns are fairly common when things are comorbid with one another. So for example, if someone has PTSD, they also very commonly have other things like sleep disorder, depression, and substance use. Someone with PTSD has trouble sleeping. That can lead to sleep disorder. They can be depressed because of their trauma, and they can use substances as a way to attempt to self-medicate so that they don't remember their trauma. So those things are very often comorbid with one another. This is a chart that's taken from your textbook, and I just wanted to go through it a little bit so you could see how common various disorders are. So you can see that about 10% of the population or percentage of the US population is impacted by bipolar and depressive disorders, and about 18% of the population is impacted by anxiety disorders. We're going to talk about each of these disorders separately from one another in a little bit. You can also think about these numbers as overlapping. So some people who have depression also have anxiety. So it isn't necessarily that 65 million people have both of these disorders combined. The number is smaller, if that makes sense. And if you'll notice, about 1.1% of adult population tends to have schizophrenia. That's about 2.6 million people. That's considered to be a more severe psychological disorder, and once again, it's considered to be more rare, just so you can contextualize this a little bit more. One of the things I wanted to talk about in this particular section was the different psychological theories and philosophies and how they each consider to be the origin or cause of a disorder. As we're going through this, you can think about a few things. Once again, these things tend to inform one another. So sometimes it's not this or that, it's this and that. It's a combination of factors that can be sometimes fairly complex that lead to a disorder. Some things are more due to genetics and some things are more due to the environment, but usually it's a mix, it's a combination of things. Another thing to consider is that the different areas of psychology that have different beliefs about what causes a disorder also inform therapeutic approach. So when we talk about therapies, chapter 15, in 2 weeks, we're going to come back to this because these different areas, theories about what causes a disorder inform their therapeutic approach. So the biological model is focused on biology or underlying medical causes. So they're focused on things like brain structure, changes in hormones, changes in neurotransmitters, specific injuries that can cause different disorders when you have brain injuries, and so on and so forth. So it's focused on biology and how the brain works. The psychodynamic view, you should think Freud when you think psychodynamic, talks about the source of disorders as repressed conflicts and urges. Behaviorism would state that disorders are learned. Keep in mind, when we think behaviorism, we think people like Skinner, we think people like Pavlov. According to Skinner and Pavlov, some disorders can be learned. A classic example of this would be that Pavlov trained dogs to point to ovals when compared with a circle. So they would be punished if they pointed to a circle, and they'd be rewarded if they pointed to an oval. And one of the things that Pavlov noted is that dogs, when exposed to something that was very ambiguous, that looked a little bit like an oval and a little bit like a circle, and it was hard to tell which one it was, would express some symptoms that appeared to resemble anxiety. They would whine, they would be uncertain, they would approach, they would go away, they would avoid it, they wouldn't know what to do, they would express uncertainty. And you can see how anxiety can be learned in the presence of uncertainty or ambiguity. And that would once again be the behaviorism model. The cognitive perspective focuses on irrational beliefs and illogical patterns of thought. We're going to come back to the cognitive perspective with some examples of what I mean by irrational beliefs and illogical patterns of thought when we talk about anxiety disorders later. The sociocultural perspective states that disorders can sometimes be the product of our environment, that sometimes our family, our social structure, our cultural influences can contribute to our sources of stress and anxiety, to our notions of what's considered to be normal and disordered, and that there can also be some distinct cultural differences in terms of how we consider abnormality, which I've already talked about a little bit when we talked about deviance and what's considered to be deviant and how that can change from society to society. We're going to talk just a little bit more about cultural contexts as we end out this lecture. So I wanted to expand just a little bit more on how we think about cultural context when it comes to disorders. One of the things I wanted to talk just a little bit more about are cultural syndromes, which are sets of particular symptoms of distress. So different cultures can have very different ways of expressing distress, some of which might appear to be quite unusual from people who are outside of that particular culture. So for example, I'm very curious about North Korea and North Korean culture. As a social psychologist, I find their cultural displays to be very interesting. And I was looking at the funeral of Kim Jong-il, who's the father of the most recent leader of North Korea. And during his funeral, people were displaying their grief in very interesting and unusual ways. They were flinging themselves on the ground and beating their hands on the ground and weeping in a way that almost resembled like a toddler having a temper tantrum. It was a fascinating, very overt display of mourning that was incredibly different than any mourning displays I'd seen before. Another example of a cultural syndrome would be the hikikomori in Japan. So I think this would be interesting for you to look up. Once again, keeping in mind context. So the hikikomori are usually young men in Japan who are in their 20s, who might have failed to get into university or failed out of their classes at university, and profoundly isolate themselves in their rooms. Once again, this would be, under normal circumstances, unusual. The hikikomori refuse to leave their room and will not talk to anyone. Their parents usually leave food outside their door, and they spend most of their time playing video games and reading and in profound and severe isolation. They consider themselves to be a failure and kind of withdraw altogether from society and live a very hermited lifestyle. I would once again like to mention that that's considered to be unusual under normal circumstances. They aren't self-isolating due to fear of contagion. That might be very real in the present atmosphere. This would be something that would happen in a normal functioning society that would be considered to be an interesting cultural phenomenon. The culture itself might not necessarily recognize unusual displays of distress, or rather distress displays that other people would consider unusual, as an illness. So sometimes these syndromes might not be considered to be disordered within that particular culture, even though someone looking at it from the outside would go, huh, that's a little unusual, isn't that? Different cultures might define distress and experience distress differently. So, for example, Hispanic and Asian individuals often experience and express symptoms of depression differently than other people. They're far more likely to report physical symptoms than emotional symptoms. So a Hispanic individual who has a depressive episode might not ever say that they're sad. What they might say instead is that they have aches all over their body and joints, that they have trouble eating, and that they have trouble sleeping. So they're far more likely to describe their physical state than there are their emotional state. And there are different cultural reasons why it might be considered to be normative to not necessarily talk about one's emotional symptoms or to experience or express them in the same way. So it's important to understand that disorders exist within a cultural context and can differ from culture to culture in their expression and in how people experience them. One of my favorite examples of this, I'll link you to this as an example of something you might explore further, is a really fascinating book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which is a case study of a young girl, Leah, in California, whose parents were Hmong refugees. And the Hmong had a very particular cultural way of understanding epilepsy. It was a spiritual disease for them rather than a medical one. The spirit left the body and then it returned. And the entire book is about all of the cultural misunderstandings that happened between Leah's parents and community and the doctors who were trying to treat her epilepsy, and how the doctors trying to treat her epilepsy often lacked a fundamental understanding of how the Hmong saw the disorder, and as a result, didn't communicate clearly how their treatments were being effective, and there was a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings as a result. When we also talk about things like eating disorders, for example, they can fundamentally differ in the United States versus developing countries in terms of how those symptoms are expressed. So for example, in the United States, there might be a concept of fat phobia, where people might claim to be fat, or, oh, I have love handles, or, oh, look at how fat my arms are, you know, like my arms are jiggling, my legs are jiggling. They might have fat phobia expressions of their symptoms, whereas someone from a developing country still experiences eating disorders, but experiences them in a very different way. So they might, for example, express a fear of food, or a hyper-focus on their stomach being bloated, or a loss of appetite, as opposed to associating it with fat. So the way that those disorders are expressed can be very different from culture to culture. This brings us to the idea of cultural relativity, where we need to consider the unique characteristics of the culture and the time in which behavior takes place in order for us to fully understand it. Keep in mind that the DSM is written with a very Western frame in terms of what's considered to be a disorder and how we categorize someone into a psychological disorder, but that particular categorization might not necessarily be as apt or accurate in another culture. So it's important to consider someone's culture when considering psychological disorders.